Halfway into World War I, Europe was strapped for cash. The Allies had already run up $3.5 billion in debt to the United States, in the form of government obligations held by private U.S. investors, for having purchased U.S. arms on credit. They had also sold off nearly an additional $4 billion of U.S. railroad bonds, common stocks, and securities back to American residents to buy the rest. That was basically Europe's financial limit. With not enough cash, or even collateral to offer up U.S. banks, the European allies were on the verge of not being able to buy any more weapons. Enter the government of the United States. Over the next couple of years, the United States supplied billions of dollars in loans to the European allies, and an additional few more billion for reconstruction. But once the war was officially over, the United States demanded repayment for those war loans, in full. The United States' demand pushed the world into collapse. Europe, which could not come up with the money itself by earning it through exporting more to the US, because the US had hiked its tariffs, extracted it from Germany by setting reparations miles above Germany's capacity to pay. Germany, in turn, resorted to borrowing from US banks to cover its reparations payments. As we covered in the previous episode, this created the conditions that brought economies around the world to their knees and led to the Great Depression. Today, we'll be taking a look at how things continued their downward spiral from there. On June 5, 1931, Germany appealed to the world to stop demanding its reparations payments. Roughly 2 weeks later, Andrew Mellon, who was still Secretary of the Treasury at the time, convinced President Hoover that it was impossible for Germany to make its payments. It turned out that quite a few leading financial houses and banks from New York had gotten rather deeply involved in the German bond market. If Germany defaulted, then they would go bankrupt. Hoover reacted immediately. He convened cabinet meetings and met with Republican and Democrat congressional leaders alike to get backing for a 1-year postponement of all intergovernmental debt payments. Enter Hoover's moratorium of June 20th. All private and governmental short-term German liabilities were frozen. But don't take this the wrong way. As Professor Michael Hudson explains, Hoover didn't approve, quote, in any remote sense, the cancellation of debts to the United States of America, end quote. Though he did acknowledge that debt settlement had finally become, quote, the capacity, under normal conditions, of the debtor to pay. I am sure that the American people have no desire to attempt to extract any ounce beyond the capacity to pay, end quote. The problem was, the US and Europe had very different ideas of what capacity meant. Europe defined capacity as the capacity to pay from the reparations it received from Germany. The US took it to mean the capacity to pay using ordinary budgets, and, ideally, also by cuts in arms spending. President Hoover's moratorium announcements made stock markets jump around the globe. Foreign exchange conditions finally started looking up, and more than made up for the nominal $250 million the U.S. lost in debt repayments it had temporarily put off. Initially, private international finance capital was a net winner from intergovernmental claims being decreased. While Germany had been let off the hook, the world now homed in on a different source of anxiety: London. July 13, 1931, the day the Macmillan Report was dropped, was the day things imploded. The report exposed that Britain's realizable short-term foreign claims, minus the uncollectible Central European claims, added up to £50 million. However, its foreign short-term credits totaled over $400 million. That same day, the second largest German joint stock bank, Danot Bank, went bankrupt. A frenzied run on the sterling started that destabilized its exchange parity. European exchange rates collapsed as the debt European countries had built up over the last decade finally caved in on them. As Professor Michael Hudson explains, quote, the Hoover Moratorium had come too late, end quote. It was all downhill from there. First off, the devaluation of the British sterling undercut Germany's export potential. It made British coal now cost less than German coal, So German ships opted for cheaper British coal instead of their more expensive domestic counterpart. To top things off, many German companies had been conducting their business in sterling. When the exchange rate went through the floor, they were hammered by losses. This set off a worldwide tariff and devaluation war. The first to ditch the gold exchange standard was Britain. A whole host of countries followed suit: Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. Then Portugal, Greece, Egypt, Japan, countries in South America who had major trading links to Britain, and the British Commonwealth in general. And Professor Hudson makes a critical point. Quote, "These nations formed a de facto sterling area, capable in principle of turning the tables of international economic power against the gold standard countries." End quote. The leaders of the countries that had opted to stay on the gold standard were the United States and France. Together, they held 80% of the world's monetary gold. But how much power did all that gold really give them if the majority of the world chose to use the paper sterling instead? As a result, economic tensions between Great Britain and France and Great Britain and the US worsened. One of the major reasons why President Roosevelt took such a hard line towards Britain was, in fact, out of fear that a new trading system, with a devalued sterling at its foundation, would take over the world. That brings this episode on the American Empire's economic strategy to a close. If you're interested in pulling back the curtain on how the money underpinning US global power works, I highly recommend checking out Professor Michael Hudson's Super Imperialism, the Economic Strategy of American Empire. This video is part of an ongoing series breaking down Professor Hudson's phenomenal book. If you want to understand the money that turned the United States into what it is today, from what allowed the US to rise to economic power, to how it funds its empire, you can't miss it. In the next video, we'll be answering the question, could this all have been avoided? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.